Hello and welcome to what is going to be hopefully a mind-blowing science lesson if you don't already know what's going on with PCOS. This is the PCOS deep dive a la carte video. Let's get started. Here's what we're going to cover in this a la carte video. We're going to talk about what exactly is PCOS or polycystic ovarian syndrome, what's going on with insulin and blood sugar in PCOS, especially typical PCOS, how to use do-it-yourself options to improve your fertility if you have PCOS, especially typical PCOS, Western ART considerations, so if you're doing IUI or IVF and you have PCOS, what you need to know, and beyond diet and exercise alone, we're going to talk about more big picture considerations that have to be considered when you're working with PCOS from a truly holistic point of view. Let's get started. So what exactly is PCOS or polycystic ovarian syndrome, or some people call it PCOS? It is by its name a syndrome. And what syndrome means is that there's going to be a list of things that could qualify you for having this syndrome, and you have to check off enough of the boxes out of that list to qualify for having the syndrome. So the list for PCOS is pretty short. The main three are, do you have irregular cycles? Particularly, are you irregular or having long cycles and anovulatory, or not ovulating regularly? So that's number one. Number two is, do you have elevated levels of testosterone or DHEA or other sort of androgen, typically male hormones? Now we'll talk about how that relates to estrogen dominance in a second, because they can flip back and forth with one another because they can be converted in a body. So, but elevated androgen, so male hormones, is the second thing. And the third thing is, when you look at your ovaries on an ultrasound, on a scan, do they look polycystic? So what that means is, when you look at a polycystic ovary, it's got lots and lots of dark circles on it that are follicles and or cysts. And so that will also go with high AMH, because those follicles all throw off AMH. So although high AMH isn't necessarily on that list, that's technically what doctors are looking at. If you have high AMH, depending on your age, if you're younger, over 6, and if you're older, I would say over 3 or 4, you could think about the likelihood that you probably have some version of polycystic ovarian syndrome going on in your body. Now, polycystic ovarian syndrome is very heritable. So that means it runs in families, it's very genetic, but at the same time, it's kind of interesting because although it's very genetic, it also is super influenced by lifestyle. I want to tell you something that's kind of cool about how genetic it is. So when they did scans of baby girls in utero of moms that are polycystic, the babies in utero have larger by volume ovaries already before they're even born. So it tends to be passed down, it tends to be very heritable, but again, there's good news, is that lifestyle is a big deal here, and that's what we're going to talk about. All right, so in the US alone, the estimate is about 5 million women have polycystic ovarian syndrome. I have it. And so it's not uncommon, and it's not necessarily a death sentence for your fertility. There's lots of people that have polycystic ovarian syndrome and never have any fertility issues, but it can be linked to some fertility issues, and if you're watching it, that's probably the case for you. So it's very, very common. It's not necessarily going to mean you are infertile, but it can be linked to fertility complications, especially if you're not ovulating. Think of my story. If you made it that far into the program, I wasn't ovulating at all through my mid-20s when I should have been in my peak of my fertility. So it can be a big darn deal. Now, in the old way of looking at polycystic ovarian syndrome, we used to think that it was just straight up an ovarian thing that was going on, that was a reproductive issue. But now that we have more knowledge, we've come to realize that it's actually a metabolic issue first. So the things that happen in the ovaries are actually secondary to blood sugar and insulin issues. And I want to teach you all the science about that so that you can really understand it and feel like you know what's going on and what the root is in this video. So in about 50 to 70% of people who have PCOS, they will show that they have insulin resistance. They're gonna have blood sugar issues. So one of the first things that you can do if you have PCOS or you're not sure, but you have a high AMH or a high follicle count, is you could look at having your A1C levels done. That's how you can tell what your blood sugar has been doing, and that's an average of your blood sugar actually over 3 months. So that's a really helpful test to look at what's going on as far as your specific insulin level and sensitivity and blood sugar issues. Now I'm going to go into the science here of what's going on with the blood sugar. So I'm going to put up some illustrations on the screen so that you can hopefully get this and understand it really fully. Brace yourself for some really super fancy Nicole Lang original drawings. So what we see here is basically your kettle from a baby you want perspective. So this is your digestive system. So when you put in any foods or drinks into your stomach or your kettle, anything that's not a fat or a protein is going to be broken down ultimately to a sugar or to glucose. It's going to go from your stomach into your small intestine, where it is going to leave the small intestine and go into the blood circulation. So these little dots on this drawing are that food being broken down to glucose and then going out into the rest of the body. Now, in this next illustration, you can see where it wants to go. So the cells need this energy to function. The cells need this energy to do their jobs, but the glucose can't just go waltzing right into the cells. What the glucose needs is a key to unlock the little gates into the cells, and that key is insulin. So insulin is coming from the pancreas, and the pancreas is kicking out these little triangles that we're going to call insulin, and then that insulin is going to hook up with the sugar, and that's going to allow it to connect with those little receptors on the outside of the cell, and then the sugar is going to be allowed into the inside of the cell and give it the energy to do what it needs to do. So the issue is most cells can only handle so much energy, so much glucose going into them. And if you force feed too much sugar inside or too much glucose inside, it's going to start to damage and hurt the cells. So the cells will actually become so damaged if you force feed them with nonstop sugar that they start to get sick and start to die and have problems. So the body's really wise. That's a theme, right? So the body has this way of trying to protect itself from having this happen. And how it does that is it down regulates those little receptors on the outside of the cell that let the insulin and the sugar in. This means that even if there's a ton of insulin and sugar floating around in the bloodstream, there's only so many channels that can let that energy into the cell. This is what is happening when somebody has insulin resistance. The cells are resistant to insulin and the sugar coming in. So this sort of wisdom of the body protects the everyday cells throughout your body from being inundated with way too much sugar and keeps them protected. But the problem is, then there's a pileup of insulin and sugar that stay floating around in the bloodstream because now it can't get into those cells. So now we've got all this sugar and all this insulin floating around in the bloodstream, and that starts to cause problems. What that does is it starts to be like bumper cars in the blood vessels. So in the big arteries, there's a little bit more space, but they're starting to get like those bumper cars bumping up against the sides. And so we used to think that high cholesterol was you just ate too much fat, but more and more science is showing that actually what's going on is when the insulin and the sugar is jamming and bumping into the edges of the arteries, it's causing micro damage and inflammation, and then the body tries to put some cholesterol plaques over the top like a bandage to help it heal. So inflammation actually happens first from these blood sugar and insulin issues, and then the cholesterol is a secondary issue. Now there's also issues where you're eating too much and you're not eating good foods and you're eating a lot of trans fat. So this isn't the only way that you get cholesterol, but this is a form of cholesterol in the body. Now the smaller the blood vessels get, the more and more problematic this bumper car situation of blood sugar and insulin becomes. So by the time a person is full-blown type 2 diabetic, what you see is in some of the areas in the body where the blood vessels have gotten really, really tiny, so all the way out on the extremities of the feet or in the eyes, there's these tiny, tiny little blood vessels. They can only handle so much sugar and insulin getting gummed up before the blood can't get through anymore. So this is where blindness and vision issues and diabetes comes in. This is where you could stub your toe, and then instead of the blood being able to go there and heal that injury, it turns into necrosis, and the tissue starts to decompose because it's too gummed up. The actual blood can't get out to the extremities anymore. So this is why further along diabetes, this can be very problematic and lead to things like amputations and, again, blindness. So once again, leave it to our amazing, resilient bodies with lots of backup plans and lots of ways that we can kind of try to keep ourselves as safe and as balanced as possible. The body wants to get that sugar and that insulin out of the bloodstream so that it's not causing that bumper car damage and gumming things up. So what it does is it, through a really complicated kind of way that uses the liver, it converts the sugar into fat so that it can store that energy for later. So it converts it so the fat cells get bigger and bigger and take up that energy, and the bloodstream is more cleared up and the cells aren't being force fed. And so this is where, if there's blood sugar issues, if there's insulin resistance, you're going to start to gain weight because your body's just trying to do its best to clear out what shouldn't be there. Now here's the thing with the genetic predisposition in polycystic ovarian syndrome, which is not one bit fair. They've looked at cells of people with polycystic ovarian syndrome, and on those cells, pretty much from the get-go, there are fewer receptors. So where the average person might have a set number, like let's just say for the sake of easy math, 100,000 receptors on the cell, on the average cell, people with polycystic ovarian syndrome already have 50,000. So that's going to automatically predispose to that insulin resistance and that blood sugar building up and this cascade that I'm going to continue to go into here. So it's not necessarily fair, but this is the mechanism that's going on a lot of times in polycystic ovarian syndrome. Okay, so what we're looking at up until this point is that the body, either because there was too much sugar or because of a genetic predisposition, has downregulated those little receptors for insulin and sugar on the average cell, which means that it bumps out the blood sugar and the insulin into the bloodstream, which means that the body tries to convert it to get it out of the bloodstream to turn it into fat storages. And the bumper cars also create some inflammation. So that's where we're at so far. Now, this bumper car and inflammation is happening in the gut. That's problematic. That's where a lot of people are having more and more food sensitivities and gut issues. And it's really because this has happened first. It's not because there's a problem with that specific food. It's because there's so much bumper cars that bang up the intestinal permeability, the intestinal walls, and make them more porous and more damaged and more inflamed. And now you're having issues with food, but it's not really cut out the food that's going to work. It's going to be the fix and repair the damage and decrease the inflammation and get to the root of it that's really going to make the most benefit and the most bang for your buck. In a really not fair extra layer, what happens when there's sugar that's piling up in the bloodstream is the body tries to put more insulin to go with it. And then when the person is like, hey, I'm having weight issues, I don't want to keep eating sugar, there's insulin hanging out in the bloodstream without sugar, which makes the brain think, wait, there should be sugar to go with this insulin. So sugar cravings are really common when this issue happens. And there's also other issues that are going on with other hormones that we're not going to get into here that make you feel less satiated and more hungry, and your brain is actually like, there should be sugar to go with this insulin, and so you start to crave sugar, and it's just a vicious cycle where everything keeps feeding, pun intended, into the next stage. Now, here's what happens with the ovaries that starts to get the reproductive function in. I'm not going to get into the exact mechanism because it involves luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone and the pods that grow the follicles, but ultimately what happens is when there's insulin and there's blood sugar that's floating around in the blood, that's going to ultimately also wash over your ovaries, and it's going to cause this whole complicated series of things to happen that ultimately will make the ovaries convert what it can in another way of trying to get rid of it into androgens. And androgens are male hormones, testosterone, DHEA, and the body can further do another conversion and turn that into estrogen. So you might look like you have a lot of testosterone. That's where some of the other sort of typical issues of PCOS come in. So when women have male pattern baldness or start to have more facial hair or hair on their abdomen, that's more testosterone and androgen showing up. On the flip side, men who have this sort of blood sugar and insulin issues, they start to get man boobs because that's the estrogen in their bodies, turning them into a more typical kind of female body form. So it can go both ways, but ultimately what's happening is you see that high insulin and blood sugar that's backing up is going to be converted into androgens, male hormones, and or estrogen. And that, my friends, starts to short out the feedback loops that your reproductive cycle is all founded on. So if you've made it into the nursery module, you will have had an overview of this idea that there are positive feedback loops and negative feedback loops. So a positive feedback loop is when there's enough of something that triggers the next thing to happen. So an example of this in the menstrual cycle is there's enough estrogen built up that says, hey, there's probably a big follicle here, you should get ready to ovulate. So that's a positive feedback loop. A negative feedback loop is when the little pod that had the egg in has ovulated and starts to shrivel up and go away. Then that stops making hormones, the hormones drop off, and that triggers the menstrual cycle, the actual period to start, and your body to start stepping on the gas and trying to grow the next follicle, the next month's egg and cycle. So that's a negative feedback loop, so something's missing. So when you have this blood sugar and insulin resistance happening, because the ovaries are turning it into androgens and or estrogen, it's gonna mess up this. And that's where the body starts to get really confused and doesn't know what it's doing. Should it grow an egg or did that already happen? Is it going to ovulate or doesn't it need to? Because all those levels are fluctuating enough that it's just throwing a monkey wrench into the whole business. So when you have PCOS, you are probably genetically, at least 50 to 70% of the time, predisposed to having this insulin resistance built into your cells, and then it's going to back up, it's going to cause inflammation, it's going to cause the fat cells to get bigger, it's going to freak out the ovaries and confuse the feedback systems in your endocrine system. And so the root really is to get the insulin and the blood sugar to a moderate level. This is why one of the main current treatments for PCOS from a Western reductionistic perspective is a medication called Metformin. What Metformin does, now you can understand this, is it forces the cells to put back more pathways to let insulin and glucose into the cells. Here's the issue though. If you just do that and you're not stabilizing the actual amount of sugar going into the system, you're back to that stage where the cells are just going to be force-fed way too much energy and it starts killing the cells. Particularly the cells that are absorbing the most metformin, which is an oral medication. So what are the side effects from metformin if you don't also change your diet at the same time? They're basically signs that the cells along your GI tract are getting force-fed too much sugar and they're dying. It's nausea, it's loose stools, it's bloating, it's feeling really for lack of a better way to describe it. That's what happens if you just force-feed the cells sugar to try to fix the issue. It's really, really much, much better to get to the root of it and stabilize the blood sugar and upregulate those receptors to a level where they should be. And when you do that together, you're going to get to the root and get the best big picture and reductionistic effect, which is what we're going for. So what we're going for then, holistically, is two things. We want to put less food into the system that's going to turn into glucose. So that includes fruit and dairy and carbs, and like people sometimes think, oh, it's okay because I'm eating a quinoa bowl and 5 pieces of fruit and skim milk, but that's all still sugar. Especially when you're dealing with polycystic ovarian syndrome, you still have to pace yourself and you still have to know. In polycystic ovarian syndrome, especially typical where A1C levels are elevated and blood sugar has been established to be an issue, you might want to think about this being a better fit than other people for a lower carb diet and a higher fat diet, and see how that agrees with your body. Now, that's not a across the board recommendation, but it's something that you could try and see how your body feels and watch what your A1C is doing. I also, just in general, I'm not saying people should go really low carb or keto or anything like that, or paleo, but in general, I think the average American is just force feeding their cells, and eventually the CDC data says that most of us are going to end up diabetic or pre-diabetic. I think the statistic is by the time we're 65, this was in 2015, by the time people were 65, 77% of them were pre-diabetic or diabetic. And those aren't just people with polycystic ovarian syndrome and a predisposition towards having lower receptors for insulin. These are everybody. So just think about kind of what we have access to in a modern American, especially diet. It's like we can have unlimited things that turn into glucose all day long. No one of them is terrible, but it's just the whole onslaught of something for breakfast, something for a snack, something for lunch, something for another snack, something for dinner, something before bed, that all turns into glucose that becomes really problematic over the long haul. I'll talk about this in another video where I'm talking about carbs and sugar in the future. But for now, think about lowering things that turn into sugar and maybe increasing good fats and proteins, making sure that it's good grass-fed if possible, if you can do that, so that you're not introducing other hormone exposure into your body. A couple other little side notes about just stabilizing the sugar coming into the system. So again, anything that's not a fat or a protein or a fiber is going to turn into a sugar. So eat unlimited plants. Like, plants are your best friend, and you can put some yummy fat on them to make them taste better. But like Brussels sprouts with a little bit of bacon grease, or salad with yummy olive oil and lemon juice, and some vegetables with some cheese sprinkled on the top of it. Mostly plant, a little bit of yummy fat, a little bit of protein. That's all going to be really good for this kind of a pattern and this kind of blood sugar issue. And then you want to keep your sugars stable too. So don't just cut them and make your body crave more. You want to make sure that you're eating a really nice breakfast and you're skewing your bigger meals towards the beginning part of the day, so that you can kind of like cook that and keep your blood sugar stable throughout the day. So like having eggs for breakfast, having a smoothie that's got some protein in it. Again, always listening to your body. If there's something that you try and you're like, that just does not agree with my system, that vetoes anything that I would say, anything anybody would say. But listen to your body and skew towards things that are going to kind of just like slowly break down throughout the day to keep your blood sugar nice and stable. So that's number one. The first thing you want to do holistically for do-it-yourself is just keep that blood sugar lower and more stable throughout the day. But what that's going to work really well with is number two. You also do really want to work on getting those cells to have more receptors so that the sugar and the insulin can go in at the rate that they should be going in. And how you do that is primarily through some exercise, but not hardcore crazy exercise. Actually, hardcore exercise is going to make your cells even more protective and slow your metabolism down, because it's like, we're working a lot. We need to hoard that. So you want very moderate exercise that feels very sustainable. So some exercise ideas that I like for PCOS are just when you eat your 2 biggest meals of the day, getting up and doing like a dance to a song or 2, or running in place for 3 minutes, or doing some jumping jacks and some, bend and twist and touch your knee, or do a little bit of something that gets your blood flowing, lights that fire, as they say in yoga, anything like that. And literally, I'm talking like 3 to 6 to 8 minutes of exercise in a little bit of burst, especially when you're putting in that sugar, is going to give your body a really strong message to upregulate. There are also some supplements that I'm going to list in the resources for this video that are nice for stabilizing blood sugar, and one of them actually helps upregulate the receptors. That's called Gymnema. That's a kind of cool supplement if you do have low receptor issues. And then of course there's Metformin. You can talk to your doctor about doing the same. But remember, if you're doing these things and you're still putting in a bunch of sugar, it's going to cause a whole bunch of GI distress, and it's not going to feel good, and it's not going to really register holistically, because you're going to trade one issue for the other. You're going to trade, less blood sugar backing up in your bloodstream to force feeding those cells and causing the cells to be miserable. You don't want that. So let's talk about assisted reproductive therapies like IUI and IVF and PCOS. So the good news here is you pretty much can take out one of the two factors that could make you want to rush into ART. One of the factors is how much do you have on deck, and as we've seen in polycystic ovarian syndrome, you probably have a lot on deck, especially for your age group. You have a lot on deck. So the other factor that you want to think about how fast you need to get to doing ART is how old are you. So if you are, youngish and you have a lot on deck, it's not that big of a deal to holistically take a step back and spend a couple or a few months working on your big picture, stabilizing your blood sugar, getting your insulin levels more stable, making your body feel less out of whack, less inflamed, and that's going to help your outcomes. So I highly, highly encourage people to do whatever level of stepping back and repacking their picnic basket before they march into the dark and scary woods of fertility treatments they can do when they have polycystic ovarian syndrome. Again, there's going to be some supplements listed. One other thing that has been kind of debatably shown to be helpful for IVF is vitamin D levels. It especially seems to be true when you have polycystic ovarian syndrome. You want to look at your blood or your vitamin D levels. So have a look at that. Make sure that you're supplementing with a little bit of vitamin D. Look at the other supplements that can help you stabilize your blood sugar and get that insulin level more even, and then you can go from there. You are more likely to hyperstimulate. So ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome, OHSS, is more of a risk if you have polycystic ovarian syndrome, which makes sense, right? So make sure that you talk to your doctor about what's the game plan, how is this being watched for and prevented, and what's the plan if it starts to happen. There's also going to be eventually an a la carte video about OHSS, so make sure you check that out once it's up and have a plan for what you can do to make sure that you stay as comfortable as possible when you're stimming and you prevent hyperstimulation. If you're not doing IVF and you're just doing like oral meds, be very careful if you're at a clinic that's like, we're just gonna throw you on some Clomid and send you home to have some sex. That is the recipe for multiples if I ever saw one. And that's a terrible position to be in, because when you work so hard to be pregnant and get pregnant, you don't want to have to then think about selective reduction or a really high risk, scary pregnancy. So if you have polycystic ovarian syndrome and you're doing an IUI or you're planning on having intercourse, but you're doing any sort of ovarian stimulation, even really low level oral stuff, do make sure at least for the first couple of months you are being monitored so that you know, is your body growing 8 follicles? You don't want to do an IUI with 8 follicles. That's IVF turf. So make sure that you know that your doctor has the medication dose right, what your body's doing before you just are like, it's fine, I'm going to just have some sex. So pay attention to that. We are almost done with this video. I hope it's given you lots of empowering information. I want to talk about the very biggest of big pictures before I let you go, because I've given you information that's very reductionistic and very Western in this video, and you need to know this, and it'll help you understand so many things that you're going to bump up against on this journey. But I also don't want you to put back on the blinders of PCOS and I'm going to read every label and just count carbs and just cut down my sugar, because that is not going to tip your scales in the right way. And we know that other things are inflammatory and other things are bad for your hormonal profile and your feedback loops, and those other things are cortisol levels and stress and inflammation from being super stressed out and having high cortisol. So don't just trade one issue for the other. You want to stay very big picture. So if you're going to tweak your diet, do it in sustainable, enjoyable ways. See if your partner can join you so that you can still eat the same foods and enjoy meals together. See if you you can, look at fun recipes or join, meal clubs where you get good ingredients sent to you. See if you can make this something that's not going to stress you out and not going to overwhelm you and not make you feel like you're a fertility martyr. And remember, date night and intimacy and romance and fun and breathing and gratitude and just moving your body in fun ways. I love the idea of putting on songs and dancing. One of my main forms of exercise is just dance videos on the Wii. So have fun with this. It doesn't mean you have to force yourself to go to the gym at 5 a.m. And when we get to the house module, if you haven't already, really, really pay attention to the videos that are about your kettle and digestion, because there is this line in Chinese medicine where if you overdo it and try to exercise too much, or you cut down what you're putting into your body too much, it's actually gonna bite you in the butt. It's going to be 1 step forward and 2 steps back, and it's not going to register. So that'll give you even more information on why that's the case and why you shouldn't do that. So keep on adding small and cumulative, keep on expanding your knowledge. Again, I hope this video has felt super empowering. I hope you can stay really big picture and really truly holistic, and that this is good food for thought. I'll see you again soon.